Joan Breton Connelly, New York University professor, MacArthur Fellow, and author of The Parthenon Enigma, A New Understanding of the West's Most Iconic Building and the People Who Made It. Joan, thank you.
Thank you.
Joan will rejoin us later this hour. In just a moment, we'll talk with music archaeologist John Franklin and archaeological illustrator Glynnis Fawkes. That's after a short break. Stay with us. You're listening to Living Lab. I'm Heather Goldstone. We're talking this hour about the archaeology of ancient culture, how we investigate the intangible aspects of ancient life, and what it means for our modern lives. Joining me now in our Woods Hole studio is Glynnis Fawkes, an artist, cartoonist, and archaeological illustrator who has worked on excavations in Cyprus, Greece, and the Middle East. She's drawn comic versions of the Homeric hymns to Aphrodite, Demeter, and Dionysus. And a Fulbright scholarship resulted in 2 books, one of paintings and another of cartoons about Cypriot archaeology. Also here, John Franklin. He's an associate professor of classics at the University of Vermont. He combines his expertise in music composition, electronic music, and classics to not only study, but reconstruct and even remix ancient music. John, Glynnis, welcome to Living Lab.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, before the break, Joan was talking about this kind of synergy that happens when you have an artist on the site of an archaeological dig. Glynnis, you are an artist, but presumably when you are on site, you are there with your archaeological illustrator hat on. What is the role of an archaeological illustrator, particularly in this age of easy photography, and how much of what you are doing is attempting to capture scientific reality, and how much of it is more of an artistic interpretation of what's going on?
That's a good question, and people always ask me that. Why not just photograph these things? And of course, every object that is dug up or discovered is photographed, and but there's a lot you can tell from an illustration or drawing that you cannot tell from a photograph. Say, I find, not me, but the archaeologists find a rim of a cup, a broken cup, and a photograph will make a nice picture of what color it is or if there's any decoration. But with an illustration, I can reconstruct the diameter of the cup, the angle of the rim on the cup, which will tell you what kind of cup it is. It could tell you, in combination with the shape of a rim and the angle, where it's from, and also in a long sequence of time. Certain sites, especially, I liked doing this on Komos, the site in southern Crete that was a Minoan seaport that had a lot of connections with Phoenicians. So that there was a very specific sequence of from levels up to down of time period of certain rim angles changed over slow increments to more straight up, and decorations changed. So my illustrations of these details were very important in defining what level and what relation that level was to other levels and other sites on Crete and all over the Middle East. So it's extremely detail-oriented work, and I measure everything to the millimeter. And yes, and
I mean, there's clearly an element of discretion, if not interpretation, involved here in what aspects of something you are choosing to illustrate. Is that a decision that you're making on your own, or are you in consultation with the archaeologists who are digging this up? You know, what are the important things that you need me to capture as an illustrator?
Exactly. So often there on Komos, I would go over every piece with the archaeologist, and he would say, now make sure you have this angle rim at like this to, this sort of angle. That's what we're looking at, because these are wheel thrown ceramic cups, but they're not perfect. I mean, some of them could be squished on one side, or the break could be right. So it's very fiddly. But recently I've been working at the site of Cancri in Greece, and that is a Roman port city on the Athens side of Corinth, and there I get free reign. I mean, they say, you know what you're doing, just do it. But and this is a Roman site, so there's entirely different types of vessels, and often they're confusing. So we'll go after I work for a bunch of days, and the archaeologist will check and say, no, I think this is more at this angle because this is an Eastern sigillata from Syria, so it should look more like this. So I work very closely with the archaeologists in interpreting the vessels.
And are there times when perhaps your perspective as an artist and with your experience, I mean, you're careful to say you're not an archaeologist,
Right.
but of course you've been doing this for long enough that you do have your own expertise. Are there times that you perhaps catch details that the archaeologist has overlooked or interpreted in a different way?
Oh, sure. Yes. And I remember one time, especially in Israel, where I had it was some kind of plaster decoration where I think 3 or 4 archaeologists looked at it and were trying to fit it together. And I just turned it some way and went click. And the archaeologist grabbed me and gave me a big kiss.
Now, John, you and Glynnis, as I understand it, now husband and wife, met on a dig site or while you were both in the field. But you are an archaeologist who studies music. So what is it that you might be looking for in the field? Are there clues that we can find to ancient music in a dig site?
There are. I'm not a field archaeologist. I mainly do my work in libraries, but things do come out of the ground that relate to music. So we might find in a grave, there might be remains of an instrument that was buried with a musician, for instance, or there might be a relief, a votive relief from a sanctuary that has a musical scene on it that might give information about the dimensions of an instrument or the kind, what kind of instrument it is. There's the same concern with morphology or the shapes of things that Glynnis mentioned with respect to pots. We have also with instruments. So let's say a lyre, that's a kind of harp-like instrument, is found either the remains of a physical instrument or the representation of one on a plaque or in a figurine or some other medium. If I see the shape of the instrument, I have some sense of what period it's from, maybe different geographical affiliations it might have. So yes, the same considerations apply, but in this different sphere. Occasionally, a papyrus with musical notation will come out of a dig site, mostly from Egypt, but sometimes from Greece itself, and these will often have the music notation on them.
So how much of that kind of musical notation do we have? I mean, it's a very small amount that we have at this point.
Yes. So in the latest published collection from Oxford in 2001, there were 66 fragments, and the numbering depends on how you count it. So, for instance, one of these fragments is a vase that shows a trumpeter and has the syllables te, to, ta next to it. So it's clearly an attempt to represent the sound of the trumpet. Does it go beyond that? Some people have argued that te, to, and ta will correspond to different overblows on the trumpet, different bugle tones, if you like. Other people think, no, it's just a rough attempt to represent the sound. So do we call that a fragment of music or not? So the counting varies a little bit. Also, new pieces of music come to light regularly. So as people excavate, and especially in Egypt, in the papyrus dumps of Egypt and other contexts in Egypt, a new fragment of music will come up every few years. So in another 30 or 40 years, we'll need another collection published with all the new finds. Yes.
So with that much controversy over what even constitutes musical notation, how do you a lot of what you do is trying to reconstruct essentially ancient music. How do you actually go about doing that from those tiny fragments of information?
Well, in the case of, there was a well-defined system of music notation. So when we get a papyrus or an inscription that uses it, it's very clear that that's what it is. And we've known how to convert from that Greek notation to modern notation since the 19th century. So it's always clear, usually clear when we have a piece of music. Now, if it's a papyrus that has suffered damage in the ground and has holes, maybe at a crease mark or through some other form of damage, then you may be missing some of the musical notation, or one of the musical symbols, there may only be half of it, and then you have to and there may be several symbols that will fit the remaining trace that's on the papyrus. Then you get into more interpretive controversies. So let's say hypothetically, such and such a sign could be interpreted three ways. If it's version A, it'll fall into a different key than if it's version B or version C. And then you often you run up into a wall and you can't progress beyond speculation. In other cases, you may be able to say, well, here's another piece that seems to be from the same century, from the same part of Egypt. It uses a certain sets of notes that seem to indicate a well-defined mode. If with our new piece we go with option A, it will fit into that familiar pattern. Therefore, it's somewhat more likely to be that interpretation. The danger there, of course, is that you run the risk of leveling the evidence into a smaller number of categories than the reality was, because you're trying to make connections between the few positive pieces of information you have. I mean, what if the note in question is the exception to the rule and is some radically interesting avant-garde note, and you're editing it out of the record by doing this matching to other material.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've actually brought an instrument with you, so tell us a little bit about what this instrument is, who might have used it in the past.
Okay, well, this is a Bouzouki. This is the standard instrument now of Greek folk and popular music. It's relatively new in Greece even. It has entered the Greek mainstream in the 1920s with the population exchange with Turkey after the disastrous Greek expedition into Turkey after World War I. I brought it because my ancient replica, which is a kithara, a kind of lyre, was too big to carry in the car with all our luggage. So this is a handy way to perform.
So can you give us a sample of what some ancient Greek music might have sounded like?
Sure. So this is a little selection from a piece which was inscribed on the side of the Athenian treasury at Delphi. We know it was a hymn to Apollo that was literally inscribed with the notation over the words to the hymn. We have another inscription relating to the same event, telling us who all the performers were, what year it was, 127 BC. It was a sacred mission from Athens to Apollo at Delphi, and they performed this and another hymn. And I'll play you the opening sections of it. It's partially damaged. The stone was broken away, so in some cases the notes are made up. And what the notation tells us is only the notes of the melody, and the rhythm of the music is not specifically notated, but is latent in the meter of the poetry, the long and short syllables. So effectively what we get is like a lead sheet of a jazz tune. We have melody and rhythm. Everything else relating to performance, instruments used, what they might have played under the melody, comes from circumstantial evidence. So I'll play you the first section, and I won't tax you with my singing, just to give you what the tonal information is.
Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, you're talking about putting this together. We've got some notation. We've got rhythm that we're essentially assuming, I guess, that the notes, the rhythm of the music would line up with the rhythm of the poem.
That's right.
Even in making that sort of assumption, are we perhaps taking the risk that we are making an assumption based on our own, as Joan was mentioning earlier, kind of imposing our own modern idea of what music and how music and lyrics should line up?
Yes and no. So we know that in this period and in this style of piece, because the notation is clear on this point, we know that there's one note of melody per syllable of the text. There's a few cases where there's a long syllable and two melodic notes occur, but it's clear because of the way the notation symbols line up over the text symbol. So that much is clear, but there's certain things about the interpretation of ancient rhythm that we're not certain about. So, for instance, was there a pause at the end of a unit of verse, a line of verse? Sometimes we'll have a obvious break in sense. Should we stop there for a while? Was there some instrumental interlude before the song went on that's not represented? So there's that sort of uncertainty. And then, of course, in the case of me playing this on the Bouzouki here, my command of the instrument is limited. My sort of experience with playing this comes from, playing Neil Young on the guitar, so I'm sort of strumming it in that sort of way. So all of those sorts of things are interventions on my behalf, which is why I was careful to point out that what is represented in the ancient notation is simply the melody and the rhythm. Everything else I made up.
All right, I'm talking with music archaeologist John Franklin and archaeological illustrator Glynnis Fawkes. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be rejoined by archaeologist Joan Breton Connelly. Stay with us. This is Living Lab. I'm Heather Goldstone. We're talking this hour about the archaeology of ancient culture, how we learn about ancient music and theater, and how that can shed light on the culture and social values of ancient people. My guests are Joan Breton Connelly, professor of classics and art history at New York University, a MacArthur Fellow, and author of The Parthenon Enigma, a new understanding of the West's most iconic building and the people who made it. Also music archaeologist John Franklin, associate professor of classics at the University of Vermont, and Glynnis Fawkes, artist, cartoonist, and archaeological illustrator. She's drawn comic versions of Homeric hymns and published 2 books about Cypriot archaeology. Now, Glynnis, why create cartoon versions of ancient myths? Why this particular style of illustration? And for that matter, why do we need illustrations of these myths at all?
We don't, but it's fun to do them. And I think that I did them really because whenever I read these ancient myths, these very vivid images come to mind. And I think they're very much affected by me having spent time in Greece and in Cyprus and working on different projects and reading a lot. And I can't help but want to bring to life this ancient past in a new way. And I just reading them, or hearing stories, or I just want to. I can't help but want to draw them, and I think I wanted to explore the form of comics, because it's something that's very vivid and rising form in these days, and I had always done comics, and in Cyprus, while I was working on paintings, I also kept having these funny ideas about the different issues in archaeology. And from spending a lot of time drawing artifacts, they just seemed funny to me. And so I kept drawing these little scenarios.
Now, I have to say, when I first think of comics, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, if you're illustrating, the idea is to illustrate something that you couldn't perhaps photograph. And I tend to think about the comics that are superheroes or more futuristic. Here you're illustrating the past because that's what we can't see and we can't photograph. And Joan Breton Connelly, this is something that you pointed out earlier, that essentially that's what the ancients were doing as well with their sculpture and with their artwork, was creating images of the past they couldn't see. Do you see kind of a parallel here between illustrations of ancient myths and what the ancients were themselves doing?
Absolutely. It is the desire to look back and to say, where did I come from and how did my great-great-great-great-grandparents live? What Glynnis is doing is so tremendous in that she is giving access to the ancient past to a whole new generation. And I have to say that her books in Cyprus I have given to my niece and all my nephews, and this is tremendously important to engage the next generation and to give them a way in. As a child out in Ohio, I first was familiarized with Greek myth through beautifully illustrated books. And I have to say, I far preferred them to fairy tales. I'm even talking 4-year-old and 5-year-old. It was those images that artists drew that brought me into a world that I have never left. So the work of an illustrator, of the talent that Glynnis has, is absolutely tremendous for the humanities at large, especially at a time when the humanities are under pressure in our universities, etc. We do need to open this work of ancient myth to the broadest possible audience, and I really salute her for what she's doing.
Now, John, you and Glynnis have said that one of your first ideas for perhaps working together was to create music videos of ancient music, and that hasn't actually materialized. But I wonder, what was the impetus there? What would illustrations, essentially the visual aspect of this, add to our understanding or our appreciation of ancient music?
Well, I suppose it's an expansion of the point that Glynnis and Joan were making, which is it's a way of translating the ancient material into a language with which the current generation is familiar. I would just add briefly to the previous discussion, which is that every time I use Glynnis's cartoon versions of the Homeric hymns in class, it's invariably the most successful day of the semester, and she comes in and speaks about it, because the students have read thousands of pages of comics, and it's translating it into a language they know and making it relevant. So in terms of the videos, it would be a way of taking one of the ancient pieces of music, which has words in a foreign language that are inaccessible, so you would have to translate those or give subtitles, but you could illustrate them in a way that was reminiscent of or played against the conventions of modern music videos. So you present them sort of as rock or pop videos. It's another thing I do in my musical remixes, if you like. I use modern software for electronic music and dance music to present these ancient melodies in a way that's will bridge the divide from the present to the past.
Glynnis, when you hear the ancient music, does that in any way feed back into your understanding of the myths? Is this a two-way street?
I think then specifically, John did a great song for a Sappho poem that definitely resonates with what the poem looks like to me. I mean, the imagery of the poem. And I don't know, I think of the motifs from Greek vases or figures from Greek vases whirling and dancing.
Right.
Now, John, are there things that we could learn about ancient culture more broadly by learning what their music sounded like?
About ancient culture more broadly? Well, I mean, it gives us, much early poetry in Greece, so Homer and the Sappho, the archaic poets, and even drama, Euripides and so on, was musical. So it was a key aspect of these productions. So to take Euripides, for example, students typically read it in a class on myth or drama or literature, and it doesn't come to life in the way that it would if it had its original music. It would be like reading the libretto for a musical without seeing the dance, the costume, the music, and so on. So it's a major part of the spectacular experience that the ancient audience had. So it is, to leave it out is, when especially now when it's possible to include it, is no longer pardonable, I think.
Well, and, there are studies of what different keys, what different rhythms, how they kind of connect with our psychology, and why different kinds of music, even, over the past few decades, has been popular, what that tells us kind of about the general psyche. Yes. The ancient music that you were playing a little while ago is really fairly foreign sounding, and
that's right.
Minor keys, and could that tell us anything about how ancients related to music, or kind of what their psyche or perspective was on this poetry and on performance?
Yes, it could. I mean, one area that hasn't been looked at much yet is to try to connect all the material we have in people like Plato and Aristotle on this very subject, the ethos theory of music, what the Dorian mode, what kind of mood it induces, or what kind of character formation it's capable of, and trying to connect that with the surviving fragments of music and saying, see, does this piece that we know to be in the Dorian, does it somehow exemplify what Plato and Aristotle tells us about? So yes, there's a lot to be learned from that still.
Now, you mentioned a little earlier that you do essentially modern remixes. You have this expertise in composition and electronic music. When you are creating a modern remix, what is the goal? Is it simply to create something fun to listen to?
That's as Glynnis said with the comics. It's not necessary, but it's fun to do. That's the bottom line. But as I do it, I do think of different strategies for contextualizing the ancient melodies. So if we only have melody and rhythm, and you have to supply everything else, you have a choice between just making it up out of whole cloth, or of trying to tie it in somehow to the ancient world. So one of the things, for instance, I like to do is find a passage, for instance, Herodotus, that describes a performance, a military band using harps, panpipes, and double oboes and drums. Why not take one of these melodies and use emulations of all those instruments? So then you are hearing a real ancient melody in an impression of an ancient sound environment. Of course, it's not really what it sounded like, but it's a lot closer to what it sounded like than just making it up completely from your head. So I try to remove my voice from the process by putting pieces of ancient information, not just hard musical information, but historical and cultural contextual information, putting that in there as a sort of a setting for the gem that is the ancient music itself.
Now, Joan Breton Connelly, you talked a little bit earlier about, the impact of modern archaeologists essentially overlaying our modern sensibilities when we're looking at the ancient world. At the same time, you obviously want to maintain interest in the ancients. Do you see a danger in this kind of mixing and melding of the ancient and the modern, or do you see that as a positive progression?
Oh, I see it as completely positive. For starters, if we stick only with what is concrete and what comes out of the ground, we lose an awful lot of the complete ancient picture. In an ancient world in which there was no media, no film, photography, internet or television, the centrality of live performance cannot be overstated. So if we tell the story without focusing on live performance, acoustics, movement, the ephemeral, we are presenting an incomplete and false picture. How do we access this?
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Joan Breton Connelly, John Franklin, Glynnis Fawkes, thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's our show for today. You can find links to more of John's music and Glynnis's cartoons on our website, capeandislands.org. And of course, you can always find Living Lab Radio on Facebook and Twitter. This is Living Lab. I'm Heather Goldstone. Thanks for listening.